Salutations, ladies and gentlemen, the Knife Raven here, back again with another video, and in today's video, depending on when you're seeing this is either right after another video within the same day, or this is the day after. Either way, unusual, I know, but today I will be taking a look at a pattern of knife I have never had before, from a company that I most definitely have bought from before, and that is the Capped Pruner by Arthur Wright. Now, this is a very, very interesting pattern by a Wright & Son, and as you've probably noticed, yes, I very much like these knives and have been collecting them for a while. This model I held off on because it was a pruner, and generally I don't have a use for those. The only exceptions I make are in the case of very small pruning knives such as this, which is the peach pruner, my only other style of Arthur Wright pruning knife, and this, which I believe is called either a half pruner or just a capped pruner, is a model that is currently, as of uploading this video, available on Heine Haynes from Wales, which is where I purchased this, along with a few other knives, including one other Arthur Wright. Now, this is again a pattern I wouldn't choose over, say, a lambfoot or a barlow, or especially an Ettrick, but it's one that I wanted to have in the collection, as it was quite different overall, and one just to fill a role for a classic pruning knife that I otherwise wouldn't have. And I must say, this is a very, very well-made knife. It's not perfect, as is typical with Arthur Wright. However, it's very, very nice. This one cost around 30 pounds, I believe. So, sitting at around the 50-ish, 55 Canadian mark. But fairly reasonably priced, pardon me, for a handmade knife. But I'll go into some of the details on this, starting with the handles. We have ebony wood for the covers here, and this side is just the typical pure inky black for the tone of the wood, which is again common amongst ebony knives. But on the other side, we have a bit of a different coloration, and the camera is not going to pick it up probably. No, it doesn't look like it wants to. Well, that's unfortunate. This side is a bit lighter and has some chocolate brown streaks running throughout. But again, you can't see those because the camera quality is mediocre. I really need to get a better camera. Regardless, this is typical ebony wood, and it usually runs from dark brown to black, and this features both of those colorations, mostly black on this side. And again, you have some fairly good width in the covers. Doesn't feel like you're being ripped off. You're getting some significant chunks of ebony there. Of course, brass liners and pins. Being a larger knife, we have 4 pins on each side, as you can see here, and they are fairly flush. You can tell there's a difference in material, but they aren't raised by any means. Same on this side. The transitions from handle to cover, or bolster to handle, I should say, are very smooth, you can see. Perhaps there's a very slight bit of raise here you can feel, but for the most part, very good transitions overall. And the same can be said with the cap, which is a very interesting aspect to this pruner that isn't commonly seen. But more about that in a second. Nickel silver, of course, on the bolsters with a mirror polish that currently is a fingerprint magnet. There you go. Fairly nice polish. You can see there are some very small scratches on the bolster on this side. Nothing I'd complain over, but, you know, it is there. And one thing I'm not a huge fan of on this knife is the lack of a nail nick. I know, why would I be saying that? Usually everyone hates nail nicks. Well, I see them as something to have on a knife, particularly a slip joint. But it's always good to have a pinchable knife. Now this is very clearly pinchable, because if it wasn't, well, you'd have no means of opening it. But even if it is pinchable, a nail nick would still be helpful As in the case of the blade being wet, and I've noticed this myself as I have been oiling this blade, trying to open it when the blade is wet is not easy. If there was a nail nick, it would be a little bit easier to do, but regardless. It's a strong spring. I'd give it an 8. For Arthur Wright, that's a little on the lighter side, but still very nice snap to it. It's already accumulated a bit of a patina, as again, I tried oiling this knife. I usually keep my carbon blades with a thin layer of oil at all times, just to ensure that they won't corrode. But this one, to open it, you kind of have to have the blade in a perfectly dry state. And so because of that, you can already see there's been some patina accumulating on the blade. But no rust, thankfully. We have our A. Wright and Son Limited Sheffield, England stamp, which is a bit of an older stamp from what I recall. I believe they've moved mostly to the A. Wright Sheffield, England, which is a smaller stamp, but this one features the typical older A. Wright stamp. Very clear, and the tang by no means obscures anything. It's not like the printing is hidden with the bolster, so very clear. No blade play, which is typical on Arthur Wright. They're very, very solid, sometimes to a fault. Transition from spring to blade looks a bit uneven, but can't fault the physical transition. Gapping on this knife is minimal. There are some very, very, very slight gaps here and here. Those are the only ones I noticed, with the most significant again being by the cap part of the knife. But holding it up to the light, nothing shines through. So generally I will view gaps in 2 lights, quite literally. The first is the cosmetic, and the second is the functional. If a gap is significant enough that you could get something stuck within it, and again, you'd very clearly have light shining through in that case, as the gap would be that significant, that's going to be a lot worse off for the knife than if the gap is just cosmetic. These are cosmetic gaps, as no light can shine through. Chances are they are very, very minimal, and thus it's not like you're going to worry about getting dirt stuck in them. So minimal on the gapping side. We have again a polished spring, which is carbon steel, so this will patina along with the blade. And of course brass for the liners, which are ditched in typical Sheffield fashion to minimize the likelihood of gapping between the wood and the brass. There you are, fully open. This is a large knife, quite significant. You have an easy 4-finger grip on this, and then some. Again, it's probably the largest Arthur Wright knife I own. Let's get a measurement in. Overall, you're looking at 7 inches on this, so definitely not a small knife. The blade is coming in at around 3 inches. Again, that is the curved edge. I don't know what it would be if you counted the edge in a stretched out state. I don't know how the laws work when it comes to that, as a curved blade is always going to appear shorter than it actually is. But it's sitting in just under 3 inches overall. The cutting edge alone is at around 2.5. So again, use that as you will. I don't know if this would be a UK legal carry if you were to measure the edge in a state where it isn't curved. So I'm not sure if that will affect anything. I don't live in the UK, but for the most part, this should be legal in most places. Again, nice satin finish on the blade with some patina forming. The tip is incredibly sharp on this, so that is something to be celebrated. And as for the edge, it's definitely sharper than the typical Arthur Wright knife, but lately they have been upping their game and actually sharpening their knives. So I'd say this is Arthur Wright sharp based on the new definition, which is to say sharp enough to be used, but not sharp enough to be ideal. But again, has a very elegant profile. And if I had to describe it, I'd probably say it is a chunkier Ettrick pruner. Here's an Ettrick from Arthur Wright. This one is the Warncliffe course. So the blade shape is different, but I don't know how well that can be seen, but it definitely looks like a larger, chunkier Ettrick in terms of the handle. And then the blade, of course, being a different shape. But very similar. Again, these are both ebony wood knives. There you are. And I suppose I will compare it with the other Arthur Wright pruner that I have. This is a much, much, much smaller version, and it is the peach pruner. And again, they both share a similar blade shape, despite a different execution of said shape. One thing also worth mentioning is there seems to be a bit of a swedge on this knife. I don't know if I'd call it a typical swedge, but there's definitely a change in how the blade is ground up at the top there. So whether you want to call it a swedge or not, I don't know. I'd personally call it a swedge. There you are. C70 carbon steel for the blade and spring, nickel silver on the bolster and cap, brass on the pins and liners, and ebony on the handles. All coming in at around 30 to 31 GBP from Heine Haynes. And overall, I'd have to say this was a good buy. I likely won't be carrying this knife, as it is a large knife in the pocket. It's fairly chunky, and I'm not a gardener, so I don't really have a use for this style of blade. So if I'm going to end up carrying an Arthur Wright, it'll more likely be an Ettrick or a lamb's foot. But I am happy to have this in the collection, as it fills a bit of a niche for me, as I didn't have a traditional Sheffield-made pruner up until now, and I am happy to have one. But the execution's very nice. The fit and finish is far from perfect. Again, typical of Arthur Wright. One thing I almost forgot to mention, the blade centering is good, but not perfect. It's fairly close to being centered, but is a little off to the left, and I don't think that's hard to pick up on the camera. So you can see, not rubbing by any means, but definitely not perfect. But again, that is a cosmetic problem. As long as it's not rubbing, I'm not going to be too critical at this price point. But regardless, this is a nice knife, and I'd give it a solid 8 out of 10. Again, the last 2 points would be docked for the slight imperfections on the fit and finish, and also the fact that, personally, I think not having a nail nick just seems unnecessary, as there's no harm done in putting a nail nick on. I get that this makes it feel more ambidextrous, but to be fair, adding a nail nick isn't going to change anything, as you could still pinch it open. So I think that it could do well with that, and overall, the fit and finish could go just a little bit further up to bring it to a 10 out of 10. But for me, I'd still say this was an excellent buy, and one that I by no means regret. I always like having new Arthur Wright patterns, and, well, old Arthur Wright patterns that I have owned before, just in different materials. I always enjoy their ebony and think it looks very stylish, very classy, very rustic. And again, the capped pruner is an interesting pattern that I'm happy to have. And speaking of the cap, I suppose I should address that. This is something that you may see on doctor's knives, as there is a flat end bolster, or cap as it's sometimes called, which would allow for the doctor to crush pills and the such. And obviously this is not for crushing pills, but it is an interesting thing that this knife shares with doctor's knives. And as you can see, the knife can stand up on its own. So there you are. That is something interesting about the cap. It's just a little extra piece down here. Similar to a bolster, and I suppose you wouldn't be wrong calling it a bolster per se, although if one wanted to be picky, they'd say that that is an incorrect assessment. But regardless, it's an interesting design choice, and one that I think the knife looks fairly good with. Is there another purpose behind that I am unaware of? Perhaps. By all means, enlighten me. But for the most part, it just serves to make this a bit of a different style of pruning knife, and one that is pretty common in Sheffield. So there you are. There is the Arthur Wright capped pruner in ebony. Again, 8 out of 10. Could do with a little bit of extra fit and finish work, but by no means is it necessary. And I would like to see a nail nick on this, just because it's a little extra thing that would make the knife easier to open. But there you are. Arthur Wright Pruner in Ebony, and this is the Knife Raven, as always, signing off. Goodbye.